Bye, Mrs. Jenkins. Thanks for having me for dinner.
Bye, Brent. Tell your mom I said hi.
I'm an ordinary teenager with a strange story. Or maybe not. Stick around and listen to the rest of my story. My family always had issues with maintaining their weight. I figured this is why my best friend and I, Timothy, who lived next door, got along so well. We were the same size. Timothy had a younger sister, Sherry, who hung out with us. She wasn't one of those whiny little sisters. Sherry was actually pretty cool. I never really thought about my weight until that one time when Granddad needed to go to the hospital, and those firefighters had to bust those walls down with a sledgehammer to get him out. Granddad had been bedridden because of his weight, and when he got sick, Mom called an ambulance. I watched as the paramedics came to the room to get him and told Mom they needed help to move him. They called the firefighters, and that's when we lost the wall of the house. A crane was used to pick Granddad off the bed and place him on the trolley. Then they used an automatic pulley to pull him into the ambulance. The eyes of the neighborhood families bore into my Granddad as though he was some kind of spectacle at a circus. When they finally got Granddad in, they whisked him away. Sadly, Granddad didn't leave the hospital that night. It was then and there I decided it was time to lose some weight. I checked YouTube, watched a few videos with some reputable doctors and physical trainers, and got started. The first month was hard. I did have a few cheat days at the beginning, but when I lost those first 2 pounds, that was all I needed to keep me motivated. Over the next few weeks, Timothy and I didn't spend as much time together. We didn't have a fight or anything, but I was just so focused on getting my weight down that it consumed most of my time. Instead of getting a lift with Timothy and his parents to school, I decided to walk. Instead of eating in the school cafeteria where I'd succumb to the smells of the food, I ate in the school's courtyard. After I lost about 50 pounds, it seemed as though the invisible spell that was placed over me in high school was suddenly removed. Kids who never told me hi before spoke to me. Needless to say, my social life blew up, and at 17, I had my first date. Soon it was that time, where we had to choose our prom king and queen. I was excited for Timothy when I heard he was nominated for prom king. I really hoped he'd win so he could leave high school with a bang. After gym class, I walked into the locker room, unknown to the other guys.
Okay, so Kezia told us she'd fix the ballots since she's on the committee.
Kyle said.
And I'll borrow my dad's saw to slice the legs on the chair.
Paul chimed in. This is going to be amazing. When that chair cracks under his weight, and we get videos and pictures and post on social media, we'll leave a legacy that's hard to top when we leave this school. I quickly grabbed my bag and headed out of the locker room unseen. As soon as I got home, I walked over to Timothy and knocked on the front door.
Hey, Brent. How are you? Haven't seen you around lately.
Mrs. Jenkins smiled. I'm okay. Is Timothy at home? I really need to speak to him.
Timothy, Brent's here.
Mrs. Jenkins gave me one of her mama bear hugs.
It was nice seeing you. Don't be a stranger.
She walked back to the kitchen and I watched as Timothy came down the stairs.
What do you want?
Timothy folded his arms across his chest as he stopped in the middle of the staircase. I told Timothy what I heard in the locker room.
Seems to me you're jealous because you lost all that weight and you still couldn't make the cut for prom king.
I'm just trying to save you from—
Save me from what? People who pretend to care one day and the other days just walk away from you? You made your choice to reject me, so don't come in here pretending that we're still friends, because we aren't.
Timothy walked up the stairs and I turned to walk away when Sherry called behind me.
Hi. Didn't mean to listen in on your conversation.
Hey, Sherry, you've got to talk to him, I pleaded.
I'll see what I can do.
Thanks, Sherry. I kissed her on her cheek and let myself out of the house. On the night of prom, I was pretty nervous. I stood in the crowd with my then-girlfriend, Victoria, and watched as Timothy proceeded to the stage when his name had been called as prom king. I tried to tell teachers at the school about what was going to happen, but they said unless I had proof, then it was my word against my peers. Timothy got up to the stage and waved at the crowd who was cheering him on. I watched as cell phones were lifted in the air and students began to record and take pictures. My stomach churned. I knew what was about to happen, but there was nothing I could do about it. After the prom queen was called up and they took a few photos, it was time for the king and queen to sit on their throne. As Timothy sat on the chair, a loud pop came from the chair as the chair legs broke off. Timothy's arms flew in the air, and finally the chair toppled off the back of the stage. There was silence for a few seconds, then an uproar as the students laughed at the sight. Even Victoria doubled over with laughter. I rushed to Timothy's side. He held his arm and groaned in pain as teachers tried to help him up. But Timothy was a big dude, so it took them a few minutes. An ambulance was called, and I drove back with Timothy to the hospital. At the hospital, Timothy was wheeled away, and I sat in the waiting room. I called Timothy's parents as well as my own to tell them what happened. Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins and Sherry arrived before my parents. I cried on Mrs. Jenkins' shoulder. I am such a bad friend. I'm so ashamed of who I became after I lost the weight. Maybe if I was a better friend, Timothy would have listened, and we wouldn't be in the hospital. Mrs. Jenkins held my face between her hands gently and looked me in the eye.
Now you listen here. Timothy is in that hospital bed because he didn't listen to you. Don't you dare place that burden on yourself. Was Timothy a good friend to you? Was he cheering you on and trying to help you lose weight? As a person, you are allowed to grow and improve. Friendship is a two-way street. Timothy had his part to play as well.
Mom and Dad arrived about 15 minutes later, and we filled them in on what happened.
Family of Timothy Jenkins?
A male doctor walked into the room and called. We all stood up and walked over to the doctor.
Timothy took a hard fall. The bone that connects his elbow and forearm was completely shattered. He underwent surgery and we had to place a pin in his arm. He's still a bit groggy from his surgery, but will allow one person to visit him in a few minutes.
Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins told me to go and chat with Timothy, and I followed the doctor to Timothy's room. The doctor nodded at me and told me I had 5 minutes before he left the room. Hi. I walked over to Timothy's bedside and sat on the chair. His left arm was in a cast.
Hey, I didn't expect to see you here.
Look, we've both made mistakes over the past few months. It doesn't mean we still can't be friends. I'm sorry for the way I acted. It just felt nice being seen, you know?
I'm sorry too. I guess we've both got a lot to learn about friendship.
I chatted for a few more minutes with Timothy before the doctor told me it was time to leave. I hugged Timothy and left the room. As soon as Timothy got out of the hospital, he told me that he wanted to lose weight. We started him with a different diet, and it was about 6 months till he got full use of his arm once again before we began to train together. When I started to hang out with Timothy once more, I faded into the background again. But this time I didn't mind. Over the next year, Timothy worked hard to lose the weight. In college, some of the kids at high school went to the same college that we did. They reminded us that we'd always be the fat kids from high school. Timothy and I laughed at them. The other kids didn't dare try to pick a fight with us, though. One night during one of the college frat parties, Timothy and I stood outside in the backyard, when suddenly we were doused with beer. Timothy and I looked up on the balcony. Paul and Kyle held 2 empty buckets in their hands and laughed hysterically. Timothy clenched his fists.
I'm going to kill those guys.
I held Timothy back. They aren't worth it. Let's just leave. On the way home, we saw a house on fire and a lady's screams were coming from inside. I immediately pulled the car over and Timothy and I hopped out. The lady, dressed in a robe, ran out to the balcony with a teenage girl.
Please help us.
Do you have a ladder?
Timothy called up to her.
Yes, it's by the pool in the backyard.
Timothy sprung into action and quickly retrieved the ladder. He placed it against the wall and I climbed up and helped the girl down first, then the lady. By the time the lady climbed down the ladder, we heard a few cheers from a small group of neighbors who had gathered to see what the commotion was about. A few minutes later, sirens blared and police and firefighters arrived on the scene, followed by an ambulance. The lady and girl thanked Timothy and I before they went into the ambulance and headed to the hospital. That night, Timothy and I got an interview on one of the TV stations. After all the excitement died down, we headed home. A few days later, there was a knock on my front door. I opened it and was surprised to find Kyle and the lady that Timothy and I rescued a few days ago. Good afternoon. Kyle spoke first.
Thank you so much for saving my mom and sister.
I was shocked.
And this is a little thank you from me.
Kyle's mom handed me a cake. Thanks, I was just glad to help.
And I'll make sure Kyle never bothers you and Timothy again.
Kyle and his mom thanked me again. I watched as they walked over to Timothy's house. About a year later, at Timothy's birthday party, Sherry kissed me. She admitted that she had a crush on me over the years, but she wasn't sure how I felt about her. Just then, Timothy passed.
You better be this girl's boyfriend. I can't stand to see another one of her notebooks covered with your name and hearts all around it.
Sherry blocked her face and laughed. Maybe I can do something to fix that. After the party, Sherry and I went on a few dates. I must admit that it did feel a bit weird at first, but after our 5th date, I asked Sherry to be my girlfriend. Sherry and I had been dating for a year, and things were going great, when I got an unexpected visitor.
Hi, Brent.
Victoria said. She held a toddler in her hand. What are you doing here?
I came to let you know that I'm taking you to court for child support.
Victoria handed me a document. Child support for what?
For this.
Victoria pointed at the toddler in her hands. Just then, Mom walked into the room and I quickly explained the situation to her and handed her the document.
Well, let's go and do a test now.
Mom went to the closet and grabbed her purse.
Ain't nobody going to do any test on my baby.
Victoria snarled. Mom grabbed her by the arm.
And ain't no little girl going to scam my son into paying child support for a child that ain't his.
Mom closed the door. When I told Sherry, she didn't say anything. About 2 weeks later, my parents, together with the lawyer, joined me in front of the judge. The lawyer told the judge that my parents and I wanted to do a paternity test to make sure that the child was mine, but Victoria denied us. The judge ordered Victoria to let me do the paternity test, and she adjourned the meeting for the following week. That same day, I took the paternity test, and we received the results a few hours later. I wasn't the father. I called Sherry, and I thought she'd be as excited as I was, but again, she didn't say anything. A few weeks later, as I flipped through the TV stations, I stopped when I saw Timothy on a paternity TV show. Intrigued, I leaned in to take in the show. Lo and behold, a few seconds later, Victoria walked out with her toddler. I watched Victoria and Timothy argue about who the father of the baby was. Finally, the host read the test results, and Timothy was the father of the baby. Timothy being the father of the child and the age of the child meant that Timothy and Victoria were together while Victoria and I were still in a relationship. I waited on Timothy's front porch for him to return home. As soon as I saw him, I landed a blow to his face that knocked him off his feet. "You slept with Victoria and then gave me a hard time about being a bad friend?" I walked away, then I turned back. "Tell Sherry that it's over between us. I figured she knew all along it was your baby and not mine. I'm so over the both of you." I switched my college and stayed at the dorm and only visited my parents once a month, even though I spoke to them every day on the phone. As soon as I finished college, I moved away and started a new life. I got married to a beautiful woman named Megan, and we have 2 beautiful kids together. As I look back on my experience, what was most amazing is you can be friends with someone for years and never really know who they are.